Hello, BookTube. This glorious, joyous Tuesday. It was also the date of the Boston Public Library's book sale. The Friends of the Boston Public Library put on a book sale in the Cushman room of the old library every other month, every even-numbered month. So, despite the soupish humidity outside, despite the fact that I knew I would be miserable, the Cushman room gets boiling hot even in the heart of winter. I went. And I found a bagload of books that I do not need. My secondhand book shopping has been very healthy in the last few weeks. Healthier than is probably healthy. But I brought them back here and I wanted to show them to you and talk about them a bit. There are some gifts in here, so that's nice. And I was doing good. The Friends of the Library is an organization that puts their money to good use. They make it go a long way, so it was fairly guilt-free, and I wasn't gone any length of time, so the little Fraulein did not miss me at all. But the first one is something I'm going to give. I know a young woman who is the exact age demographic for this set, and she has no what we would call discretionary income. She has no book budget of any kind. So I'm always on the lookout for stuff that she might like, and I found this. Look at this. This is Cassandra Clare's first trilogy in a box set. Just a lovely thing. Look at that. As new as the day it was bought. So I have a recipient for that who is going to be very happy. And then I found this as well. I'm going to reread this. I haven't read it in 20 years. This is Why the Last Man, Brian Vaughan's. This is the first anthology of his comic book in which a mysterious event kills all the men on Earth except for one, except for Yorick. I don't know why this hasn't been made into a movie. It's so perfect for a movie. I don't know why no one's taken it up on that. But I remember reading these first few issues. In fact, I don't think I followed the single-issue comics of Why the Last Man any further than these issues. So these will be the only Why issues that I could reread. But I remember when I read them, I thought, well, okay, this seems a little ideologically strident. It seems a little boring. And at the time, and since, I've just assumed that I thought that because there are no spandex-clad superheroes in this, and that's typically why I read comic books. I read the first issue at the urging of a friend who at the time, liked this kind of indie garbage, this kind of love and rocket stuff where there are no Kryptonians anywhere. I found it intriguing, but it bugged me and it left me blah. So when I saw this, I grabbed it to see if those impressions are still true, and it's a perfect case of I have a potential recipient for this if I don't want it. And then I found a nice, clean hardcover copy of Steve Erickson's The Gardens of the Moon. This is the first book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, his gigantically ornate military fantasy series that is kind of like a fantasy novel overlay, a sword and sorcery overlay on the Byzantine Empire in clashes with the Islamic states of the East. And there's all sorts of... The character building is wonderful. The magic systems are wonderful. It's a dense book. I mean, it doesn't look very big, but it feels like you're reading a very long book in a good way when you read this thing. And I fell off. I read the first 3 and then fell off. But I remember how grateful I was when I read this first one, because I would have customers come into the bookstore who would say, I love epic fantasy. I especially love epic fantasy series. But I've read all of them. I need a new recommendation. And when I read this and thought that it was so good, so intelligent, not talking down to its readers at all, I was happy to recommend it to a whole bunch of those people. But I myself have not reread it since those days. So I was glad to get it. I'll reread it. I don't have a copy. Then this next one, this will very much be a reread. In fact, this might be a reread soon. I'm going to have to reinforce and reclaim the cover a bit. The cover is the Science Fiction Book Club, so it's kind of ugly. But it's by R.A. McAvoy, and it is a trio for lute. And this is a trilogy of novels, Damiano, Damiano's Lute, and Raphael, set in the Italian Renaissance, starring a young sorcerer named Damiano, who has a dog, Macchiata, who can talk. Here he can talk to her with a dog anyway. And he meets a Lapland sorceress, and the devil, of course, is involved because the angel Raphael is involved as well, and it's wonderful. I'm a big fan of R.A. McAvoy, but this is the best R.A. McAvoy that there is, and it's been a long time since I read the whole thing, the whole trilogy, all at one shot. I tend to reread Damiano. I think that it's the most successful of the three books, but I was happy to find this for a good cause, so I will. It's a little bit ragged. I will have to remake it, shore it up a bit, but I'll gladly do that, and then it'll be great for a reread. Then I found another thing that's going to need reinforcement. It's a trade paperback of a gigantic book, a 1,000-page book. So it, if I don't want a hardcover of such a thing, and I don't have any copies of this book at the moment. The minute I saw the trade paperback, I realized, okay, you're not going to be able to read that unless you reinforce it. But I'm okay with reinforcing it. This is Colleen McCullough's The First Man in Rome. This is the first volume in her enormously long saga of the period in which the Roman Republic began and then commenced and then concluded its long journey from a republic to a military dictatorship. So the main character and the eponymous first man in Rome in this book is not Julius Caesar, as people who only have a thumbnail familiarity with Roman history might think. It's Marius. It's the General Marius, who was one of the first people to start that process, to start Rome becoming the process of vast numbers of armed soldiers feeling their allegiance was to a man instead of to a city or a state, and the power that gives that man. And I've had my problems with this book. I've read First Man in Rome a couple of times because this is by far the most ambitious Roman historical novel of our time. So, and it just by itself, and then you match that ambition with all the big volumes that followed, and it just sort of, if you're a fan of Roman historical fiction, which I am, I'm also an author of Roman historical fiction. I've written 2 Roman historical novels. Then you really have to read this and see what's going on in it, and it is buried in research. Colleen McCullough did a vast amount of research for these books and didn't leave any of it out, which is, it was odd coming from a mega best-selling New York Times author, the Thornbirds and whatnot. You wouldn't think that such an author would commit such a tyro mistake. That is ordinarily the sign of a beginning historical fiction author, is that they won't feel confident leaving any of their research out of their book. But nevertheless, she makes that mistake. This is 3 times as long as it needs to be to tell you what is essentially the story of Marius. But nevertheless, she tries all sorts of things. She's pin downable on even minor characters. She has done a vast amount of research. There's a huge amount of notes in the back of this volume, if I remember correctly. And the thing that I remember from the couple of times that I've read it, I came away thinking, okay, well, this would be really interesting for a student of Roman history to read. But boy, it should be better as a novel. And I felt the same way about the Thornbirds. It was a really good story. There were some really good characters, but there was almost no good storytelling. And the same is true here. I don't know. I should go back to a lot of Colleen McCullough's work and see if maybe I'm right about that, and maybe she's just not a very good writer, no matter how good her ideas are. But one way or another, I couldn't leave this behind. But I'm obviously going to have to reinforce it because I would get 100 pages in and this would fall apart. But I'm happy to do that. Then we have another book that's also huge, another gigantic 1,000-page historical novel from the 80s. This is William Sapphire's Freedom, his enormous novel of the American Civil War, with that lovely painting on the cover, original artwork for the mass market paperback. That isn't the hardcover of this just takes up a whole shelf on its own. It's a vast thing, and it's much longer than it needs to be because there's what Sapphire calls an underbook attached to the end of it. So you get the whole story of the American Civil War told from the viewpoints of a handful of people, and then you get a gigantic, discrete chunk at the back that isn't notes, which would be bad enough, but instead is kind of a narrative history, a narrative accounting of the facts underneath the storytelling that was in the 850 pages that you just read. In my review of the book at the time, I said, do one or the other, but don't try and do both. Either write a history or write a novel. But don't try and do both. Not only will you guarantee thereby that both fail, but you will also break any chance of the spell on which fiction depends. And it was my judgment that this book did break that spell and didn't recover from it. But it's been a long time, and I found this, and library book sales are in a good cause. You can rationalize any amount of expenditure. So even though it's a mass market, it's a fat mass market, I'm going to need to reinforce it. I will make myself read it. I want to see what my impressions are. Like a lot of these books, I want to see what my impressions are now. And then if, I have, unlike some people who just accumulate books, I have an easy exit door for my books. I have an easy way to get rid of them. I just make a gigantic pile in the kitchen, and the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston comes by and whisks them away. So I don't really need to worry about, where am I going to fit another book, especially if it's lackluster. I'll just get rid of it. I just need to be more ruthless about that. And then the last two books are Penguin Classics, to continue the Penguin Classic wall. And they have something in common. They have a strong note of skepticism in common with each other. The first one is this. It's The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch. Penguin has done many, many Iris Murdoch novels in the orange spine. But this was a black spine Penguin classic, like all of those. And it's about two writers, the sort of informal career-long duel between two writers, and the women folk of the two writers are variously cross-attracted to each other, to each of the writers. It's a kind of a love quadrangle, but it's if I remember correctly, I read this only one time, and I thought it was a sloppy, boring, pedantic mess, the way I think most of Iris Murdoch's novels are. In my opinion, she writes novels in a way that clearly demonstrates that she did not consider the novel a serious work of art. So she was really good at writing about novels, but when it came to writing novels themselves, she's just fussy to the point of making you want to tear pages out of the book, and tail chasing, and wordy as all get out, and tone deaf, completely tone deaf. I think I've read everything that Iris Murdoch has written. I don't think I've ever read a human character in her pages. And if I remember this book correctly, none of the four major characters come off as human at all. But I found it as a Penguin Black Spine paperback, and Iris Murdoch is one of those writers in her time when she was coming out with these big, stately piles of wet wash every year or every other year. Every critic in the Western world, for every major journal, felt like she was an important writer, capital I in italics. So she got the kind of critical attention that no one should get as a matter of course. They should have to earn it. She got genuflection constantly. I never thought she deserved it, and yet I feel a variation of that reflex whenever I see her novels. I think I really should go back to Iris Murdoch. I really should read her again. Can she possibly be as bad as I thought she was? So that's the tone that the two Penguin Classics today have in common, is that slight strata of incredulity where what they have in common is if I had seen these exact same books packaged in any other way, I wouldn't have got them. If this had just been an ordinary Joe Schmo trade paperback of Iris Murdoch, The Black Prince, I wouldn't have bought it. And same thing with this one. This is the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories, from Elizabeth Gaskell all the way to Ambrose Bierce, and including Edith Wharton and Stephen Crane and The Monkey's Paw and a whole bunch of other stuff. A really classic anthology to go on the shelves there. But it's the same thing. If I'd seen this in some other edition, I probably wouldn't have bothered to buy it in 92% humidity and lug it back here running ooze off my body. Mainly because ghost stories don't really work on me. This volume has an introduction that I haven't read by Michael Newton, and I'll be interested in reading that because the people who write introductions to anthologies of ghost stories always feel it incumbent upon them to explain the appeal of the ghost story. And that's a straw man. They're doing that. They're trying to explain the appeal of ghost stories because they're taking as their assumption that the appeal of ghost stories is not that most people who read them think they're true. And that's not true. If you're an Oxford Don or a New York intellectual or whatever, of course that's going to be your starting point. But most people do believe in ghosts. And I don't. Of course, there's no such thing as ghosts. So not only is the rationale behind a ghost story anthology lost on me, but a large part of the impact of the ghost stories are lost on me as well. But I saw it as this beautiful addition, and I want to try and appreciate. I always read ghost story anthologies. I have a couple of them here in this room, because sometimes they bring out the best in their writers. And there are a couple of things in here. I looked at the table of contents on the way back here. There are a couple of things in here that I've never read. And there you have it. That is my Boston Public Library book sale for June. The last Boston Public Library book sale that I will do for a bit of time, because the next one is on the first Saturday in August, when it is going to be 125 degrees Fahrenheit here in Boston. There's no chance that I'm going to go to a book sale or anywhere else that's not essential during August. So it will be October. That'll be the next time I go there, when hopefully the summer will be easing up a bit. We shall see. I think a totally different world in October, but we shall see. So that is my Boston Public Library book sale. There's The First Man in Rome, which I'll reinforce this and give it another try. There's A Trio for Loot by R.A. McAvoy. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it if those of you are looking for a fantasy series that's not quite like any other fantasy series that you've read, and maybe you haven't heard of it, then give it a try. I think you'll really like it. Then, just talking of fantasy series, Gardens of the Moon, of course, I recommend it as well. I recommend the whole series. I read up to volume 4 and really liked them all, and it's just kept going. So I really should catch up, but one way or another, the first one will appeal to you. And then Why the Last Man, 2 Penguin classics, a ghost story anthology, and an Iris Murdoch novel. So not the best Penguin classic shopping today, but I'm hungry for every Penguin classic with a black spine that's ever been made. And I'm not getting a whole lot of help from the rest of you, so I got to grab whatever I can find myself. And then Freedom, by William Sapphire, and this beautiful boxed collection of Cassandra Clare. That is fantastic. Can't wait to wrap that up and bring it over and give it to its recipient. So that was an hour and 15 minutes. I was gone for an hour and 15 minutes. I accumulated another pile of books, and that's it. That's it. So no more buying used books for a few days anyway. But I'm gonna pour over these and see what I can find. But I will wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.